In the last video, I showed you how well a 5-year-old gaming PC stands to today's AAA titles, and the verdict was, while it did play some older games fairly well, newer games did make it struggle. So today I'm going to show you how well can you expect a 5-year-old gaming PC to perform after you've upgraded it with modern components. Now the point of this video is to show that while PC components can get dated and fall behind over time, upgrading them is a lot cheaper than buying a new PC altogether. And if you compare that to consoles, for example, that's one of the biggest advantages of having a PC. So the three components we'll be upgrading from our 5-year-old gaming PC are the CPU, the RAM, and the GPU, three components that most affect performance. The CPU will be upgrading from a 3570K to an i7 3770K, and the logic behind this is that newer games are starting to take advantage of multi-threading and hyper-threading, and i5s are a bit behind. Obviously, you can still do perfectly well with an i5 at 60 FPS, but if you're going to upgrade, as you'll later see, I think an i7 is better suited. The GPU will be upgrading from a GTX 680 to a GTX 1080. Now the GPU is the most important part to upgrade. If you didn't have enough money to upgrade both the CPU or the GPU, I recommend just upgrade the GPU because it is going to be what is limiting the computer's performance in games most of the time. And the GTX 1080 is probably one of the most value cards you can get right now. The prices on it have really come down since the 1080 Ti was released. Obviously, you could have gone for something like a 1070 or even 1060 or an RX 480 or an RX 580. All of those would have been great choices to upgrade that 5-year gaming PC. I just chose 1080 because I just wanted to go to the extreme end to see what this PC is capable of. And the final upgrade was the RAM. I swapped from 8 gigs of DDR3 1600 MHz to 16 gigs of DDR3 2400 MHz. And the reason behind this is that with a GTX 1080 and an i7 3770K, you do want to have higher speed RAM. Higher speed RAM do affect frames in a lot of games such as Overwatch, Fallout 4, The Witcher 3, and higher RAM speeds really for DDR3 don't cost that much, especially if you're buying used. And I managed to find this great deal on 16 gigs of DDR3 2400 MHz for $60, so I went with it. Overall, this upgrade costed me around $600 US. The CPU costed me around $150, the GPU costed me $400, and the RAM cost me $600. So that's about $600 US, but that is not factoring the money you can get back by selling off your old components. Remember, I had a 3570K in here originally. That can be sold for $80 to $90, and also had a GTX 680 that can also be sold for $80 to $90, as well as the 8 gigs of DDR3 1600, which can be sold for $20 to $40. So overall, that's about $200 you can get back by selling off your old components, making this upgrade really only $400 US, which is much lower of a price point. With that being said, however, let's take a look at how much of a difference these upgrades made. We'll be comparing the same games that we tested last time. Starting off with BioShock Infinite, last time we got an average FPS of 113, this time we got 211.55, that's almost a 100% increase. Moving on to Metro Last Light, the story gets even better. We got 160.77 FPS in Metro Last Light, whereas last time we only got 60, and that's a more than 3 times increase. In CSGO, not as big of an improvement, but still pretty significant, 354.7 compared to 213.3. Moving on to some of the newer titles, we know Witcher 3 was especially taxing on that old PC. This time, it blew by with ease over 100 FPS, 102.5 FPS on Witcher 3. Assassin's Creed Syndicate also got 92.53 FPS. Ashes of the Singularity managed 64.4 FPS on DirectX 11, whereas in DirectX 12 we actually managed 79.8 FPS. In Hitman, the story was a bit similar. DirectX 11 performed a little bit worse, but this time 114.42 FPS, and DirectX 12 128.21 FPS. I just want to mention that in DirectX 11, the CPU was a limiting factor for both those games, whereas DirectX 12, due to the better optimization and lower CPU overhead, we managed to move the bottleneck to the GPU and therefore improved FPS by about 10 to 15% for both those titles. Speaking of CPU, the CPU was overclocked to 4.4 GHz, and the reason why I did that is when I ran it at stock, it was bottlenecking the GPU quite a bit in some of the newer games. But once we overclocked at 4.4, we removed all but the smallest of the CPU bottlenecks, which were then able to be bypassed using DirectX 12 API in some of those more intensive games. Obviously, I did this to show that you can easily upgrade an older gaming PC to a newer one without breaking your bank. It's going to depend on what exact system you had at the time. I'm going to say this though, you don't need exactly what I have here. Even if you have something a bit older, if you have a Sandy Bridge system, if you have an i5 2500K, you can easily get an i7 2600K. The difference between a 2600K and a 3770K is actually very minimal. The biggest difference being that there's twice the PCIe bandwidth for the 3770K, but if you're running a single GPU, that shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. Anything older than Sandy Bridge, then you might want to consider upgrading your entire platform. I think a first gen i7 is going to still run into some issues with modern GTX 1080. Some other things to consider when upgrading your older PC is to consider that if you're upgrading a CPU from an i5 to an i7, the i7 will use more power, so you do need to make sure that you have enough power from your power supply, and more importantly, make sure you have adequate cooling. I almost ran into some issues with my cooling. I was barely there. I was hitting 80 degrees in some of the games, but that was still fine. If you don't have really good cooling for your CPU, you need to consider that. Talking about GPU upgrade, I was upgrading from a GTX 680 to a GTX 1080, which had about the same TDP, so I didn't run into any issues there. However, if you are upgrading from a lower end graphics card which consumes less power to a GTX 1080 or similar, you need to make sure that you have enough power from your power supply to support that 1080. My 1080 has two 8 pins. Most 1080 will have at least one 8 pin, so you need to make sure your power supply can deliver the power needed. Anyways, that's about it for this video. If you liked it, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for future uploads. As always, thank you very much for watching and have a great day.